Hello and welcome to the Election Tricycle, in which we go around the world and focus on some of the most important elections happening around the world in 2024, notably in India, where we've already had the general election, in the United States, where we are going to have a general election in November, and the UK, where we're due to have an election this week on Thursday. And exciting though that is, what that means is that in the last week before an election, there's not very much UK news. We are just waiting for the vote to happen and for our result. But the good news is, or is it good news, that there is big news in elections elsewhere in the world. And I should have said who I was. I'm Tom Hamilton in London, and I'm joined by Emily Tamkin in Washington, D.C.
Yep, here I am reporting on the last days of our republic.
And Rohan Venkat in Cairo.
Yes, in Cairo, and looking at all
Cairo.
the republics with horror for the most part.
The other big election that we focused on, of course, last week we focused in a lot of detail on the election in France before it had happened. It has now half happened, and the not very welcome news from a progressive point of view is that in that first round, Marine Le Pen's party came first with about a third of the vote, but there is now a runoff election next weekend on Saturday, I believe, in which we will find out what the final result is going to be. There's a lot of horse trading going on in terms of how the non-far right parties choose to stand. It doesn't go without saying that the far right will win, but they are closer to winning than they've ever been. And speaking of places where the far right is closer to winning than they've ever been, Emily, can we start and possibly finish? This is going to be the main issue this week with what's going on in the States. We've had, I think, 2 or 3 major developments from the debate through to a very important Supreme Court ruling yesterday. Where should we start? Let's start with the debate. What happened and why?
Sure. Yeah, no, let's start with the debate. Why not? Okay, so prior to the debate, this was the debate between Biden and Trump that I just want to remind listeners at the beginning was the Biden campaign's idea. Because they thought we'll remind everyone of how Trump is, we'll bring him into their living rooms, and they will wake up and smell that burnt coffee and realize that they have to vote Biden. Before the debate, I had said that I couldn't remember the last time I was I had so little enthusiasm for doing something as watching this debate, because I can remember the debate in 2020. It was awful. It was so bad. There was nothing of substance. It was just 2 men yelling at each other. But in that round, it was really it was Trump yelling at Biden. And I had said to someone, I was like, and this time, it's going to be worse because they're each 4 years older. Oh, how right I was, but how wrong I was about the depth of my correctness there. From the very jump, and in fact, especially at the very jump when most people were watching, this was a disastrous night for Biden. He was speaking in a raspy whisper. He looked every moment of his 81 years on Earth. His answers were not sharp. And I'm not one of these people who's like, he didn't even know where he was. No, he clearly knew which questions he was answering, but the questions were long-winded and disjointed. And the answers were long-winded and disjointed and just not good. And further, Trump stood up there, lied constantly. Just everything he said was a lie, but with energy and enthusiasm, fine. And Biden just didn't correct it, right? And it's fine to say, oh, I think the moderator should have jumped in more. I think the moderator should have jumped back more, push back more. You're the guy opposite him in the debate. And so when you hear an obvious lie or just an obvious inane thing, like Trump saying that overturning Roe was good because the founders would have wanted it, or Trump saying that his environmental plan was, well, when he was president, they had H2O in the best numbers. If you can't in that moment say, sorry, what are you talking about? Literally, what are you saying? If you can't press such obvious falsehoods and just nonsense, why are you in the debate? This also led other people to ask, why are you the candidate? Yeah. So the night of, there's mass panic, Democratic operatives anonymously texting reporters, people going on television and saying he needs to drop out. We're recording this on July 2nd. At the time of this conversation, it is very clear that the Biden campaign is hoping to just ride this out. they had a big rally in North Carolina the day after the debate where Biden like looked and sounded more alive. Obama came out and said, "Oh, it's fine." Jim Clyburn, a powerful congressman who, it was pivotal in getting support for Biden in the 2020 primary, said, "No, we need to stay the course." The problem, well, there's a bunch of problems. One problem is that a year ago, Biden decided that he was going to run again. And so nobody wanted to, except for Dean Phillips, who we discussed on this podcast, nobody really wanted to be the one. Like if he had dropped out, there could have been a primary process and maybe people would have rallied around Kamala or Vice President Harris, and maybe they wouldn't have, and there would have been a competitive primary and the people would have been vetted and we would have had a different candidate that had been like chosen by Democratic Party voters. At this point, we're a little bit before the convention. The primary elections have come and gone. We could theoretically have an open convention, but everybody's sort of playing this game where like they have to publicly say, no, I support President Biden. And then behind doors, like, suggest that maybe they would be a really great choice for president. That's one problem. The other problem, and I think is the bigger problem, is that per polls, I think it's something like 70% of American voters do not believe that Biden is cognitively able to be the next president. I don't know how you win an election if 70% of American voters do not think that you are mentally up for the job. It is not enough to tell people, I'm going to surround myself with really good people. These people who are like, well, we have to remind everyone that we're voting for the administration, not the candidate. That has never been how people have thought. Like that, it's just not, it's too much to ask of people, right? Like, oh, I'm really voting for Secretary of State. Nobody has ever done that, especially not when you're running against, forgive me, a cult leader, right? Like where it's so much about the candidate. And if you want to make it, this is my thing. What I really thought watching the debate is like, I don't know how you are going to both ask people to believe that this is an existential moment for American democracy, that this is a crisis of like literally end of republic proportions, which I believe it is. And we can talk more about the recent Supreme Court decision that further reaffirmed that. I don't know how you tell people to believe that and also believe that the very best you can do is to put up 81-year-old Biden to have a debate performance like that.
Yeah. There was a clip that I think Frank Luntz, who's a pollster, shared on Twitter the other day of Biden during the 2012 vice presidential debate with Paul Ryan. And leaving aside whether you agreed or disagreed with anything that he said, he was lucid, he was quick, he was on it. And the difference in just performance level and how articulate he was, it was just a different world. And I think
there was a clip from 4 years ago when he was talking
even then,
to
sure,
his editorial board where he was just like way faster on the uptake. And again, I'm not saying like, oh, he's lost it, he doesn't understand. I'm saying that he looks and sounds like a person who will be 82 shortly after the election. Like,
and 86 by the time he finishes his term, if that's what happens.
Now, and listen, I just want to be clear because some people have said, the New York Times editorial board, all sorts of the New Yorker editor, like all sorts of luminaries have called for Biden to drop out, and some people have responded, "Why don't you call for Trump to drop out?" Listen, obviously, I think that Trump should not be running for president. I personally. Rocco on Sesame Street, like this character Zoe's imaginary friend who's a pet rock, like I would vote for that over Trump. Okay. But it is not fair to expect the average American voter to do that. Right. And it is absurd to say, why don't you ask Trump to drop out for the good of democracy and the republic? Obviously, he doesn't care about any of that, which is why we're in this situation to begin with. Like, why aren't you asking Trump to do the right thing? Maybe because he's never done that and won't.
Absolutely, and it's an argument about what the Democratic Party should do, isn't it? It's not an argument about what an ideal world looks like.
Right, right.
And with any political party, questions about leadership are about who you think the best person is to beat the people in front of you. The argument of the British Labour Party has never been the Tories should choose a different leader. It's always been we want to win the next election. That's not an unreasonable position for them to take.
Right. So I think whatever Democrats do now, they're in a terrible position. I think that the debate made clear exactly how terrible the position is. I don't think that, and it's a self-reinforcing cycle, right? Because now all these reporters are looking for Biden to stumble and they're going to jump on it. And they'll talk to voters who will say, oh, he's so old and that's going to stay in the news. And so I don't know how this goes away. On the other hand, it's true when people point out that other, at this point, nobody really, aside from Harris, has the name recognition. Maybe there's something like we don't actually know how any of these unknowns or relative unknowns would perform against Trump.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me is we had a brief moment like this in maybe February, right, when there was a bit of noise about asking Biden to step down, people to say like this should not be happening. And in a way, it seemed as if the campaign got over that, managed to move past it through the State of the Union and so on. And there was a sense that they've tided it over. You mentioned that now people are going to be looking for some of these things, but in a way, some folks had been looking already. What's different now, it appears to me, you had like Carl Bernstein show up on CNN and say, actually, over the last year, there have been concerns within the establishment about his mental acuity. There's people saying that it almost seems like a big cover-up now rather than just a slide. But still, I want to push back and just think, like, can we see the campaign like just moving on to something else, in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, listen, you never really know. You never know what's going to happen in the country, in the world. But I don't think that it goes away. It's possible that I don't even know what this would be, but it's possible that a certain set of circumstances come together and it moves back from the fore. It's possible that in September he has a really amazing debate. I don't really think that's likely. But it's a possibility, right? And then it's, remember how worried we were back in June, like, haha.
It feels like there are two different kinds of Biden appearance that are possible from now on, which are appearances that make things worse and appearances that don't make any difference, don't make them worse. But he just seems broadly competent and not like the guy that was on the debate stage the other night.
Right.
And that that is not a winning trajectory for a campaign that is at very best neck and neck, and realistically probably not neck and neck in the polls. Do you think there are? I mean, you've had the very public instant reaction of everyone going, "Oh my God, this is a problem." You've had the pushback from all the senior Democrats who don't want to break ranks going, "Actually, we support this guy," and then you've got the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. I am instinctively not, as someone who is very, very concerned about Biden's viability as a candidate, I feel like I can live with people saying publicly it's fine, so long as they are saying privately something's got to happen. Is that happening?
But based on every report that we've seen, yes, there are people privately saying something has to happen. But the people who privately, based on everything that we've read, the people who could be making a difference in Biden's decision are not doing that, right? So that's Obama, that's his wife Jill Biden, that's his family, that's Clyburn, and they're not like the people who could pull the lever are not. There was a really interesting story yesterday, which was that Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who is the governor of Michigan, whose name has been floated as one of the possible replacements. There was a report that she had told Biden, like, listen, I'm not the one putting my name out there, but also Michigan is not winnable anymore because there's a large Arab American population in Michigan, and he was unpopular there anyway because of the war and his support for it, and Israel's war and America's support for it. And then the debate sort of solidified that. And then she came out hours later and tweeted, like, said that was nonsense and we could still win. So you have this sort of, it was just a really clear example of the debate between, or the difference between what's reportedly allegedly being said in private and what's being said in public. I have to say also that I really resent the tone that the campaign has taken, which is that it's the bedwetting brigade that's worried about this. It wouldn't be the first time that media like threw everyone into a panic. This is not your private fiefdom. Like, the White House is not yours. It is ours. Everybody is completely correct to be panicked about the future of American democracy. And you're not entitled, like, I don't care if you work for the president. You are not entitled to, like, just the scorn with which they are speaking about people who watched that debate and had a very understandable reaction, which was panic for like, nobody wants to be having this conversation who wants Biden to, or who wants the Democrat to win, right? Like, I don't want to be talking about this, but we are, because we all watched that debate. That was your idea. So like, you made the bed. Now, like, get in there, go tuck yourself in, lie in it.
It's one of those really interesting distinctions between, and this is a really obvious and banal point, but what the hell, I'm going to make it anyway. But this is
Go for it.
amongst other things, a comparative politics podcast about different systems, where we've had a number of changes of leader within the same party over recent years in the UK, and some of them have gone reasonably well, and some of them have gone less well. More of them have gone less well than well, frankly. But what they've all had in common is that there came a point at which the party that was led by a person came to the conclusion that it could not go on like this, and they had to be got rid of. And there was, it happened, as these things do, slowly then quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was a mechanism. The fundamental mechanism was when you lose the confidence of the people who you have to have the confidence of, you go. And that doesn't seem to exist in this case.
I had a very hard time getting in my former employer. I used to work for a British magazine, and there would be a lot. Every so often they would be like, "Oh, are they going to get rid of Biden?" And I would try to explain that we don't. It's not the same. We're not in a parliamentary system, right? So you don't have the same levers to pull, and so you end up with this strange tension between like for example, there are some who are saying, well, if we replaced Biden now, it wouldn't be the will of the voters. Well, was it really the will of the voters before? We didn't really have a primary.
You had no primaries, yeah.
So it's a strange, like, it's this strange thing where like the voters have power, but not really. The DNC has power, but not really. Like, certain politicians have more power. There's no clear mechanism for the party to say, okay, we have the votes, you don't, you're out.
Yeah.
If we let, like, assume something changes, I've read an argument that were Biden to not be in the picture either by decision or because the DNC, whatever, that the only potential option could be Kamala Harris, because doing anything other than that would rip apart what little remains of this Democratic coalition here. How do you see that argument, despite all this Whitmer and whatnot talk?
Yeah, I tend to agree. First of all, she's the only one who can touch the war chest that they've built up, the campaign funding. Second of all, I think that, like, let's say they go for Whitmer, or they go for Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California. You've just jumped over the first Black woman vice president for a guy named Gavin. Like, I think that goes over pretty poorly within the party and also with voters. She's in a tough position because obviously she has to go out there and defend her boss. And so she can't say, well, wait a minute, why isn't my name coming up in these conversations? But I'm sure privately, wants her name to be coming up in these conversations.
There's been a sense that she's prosecuted herself a bit better up against Trump over the last year, taking on the abortion issue particularly.
Yeah. And I think, so part of it is that Biden, look, I think she has really strange political instincts. I think some of the things that she's said and done over her career have been baffling. But first, do I think that she would have performed better in the debate than Biden on the question of, for example, abortion rights? Like, yes. And also, I think she's not, and also, he's given her, like, the issues that she had were like the border, fallout from AUKUS. Like, they gave her really toxic issues, and so that will hurt her. But on the other hand, like, okay, like, those are the issues now, right? So yeah. Would it be worse? I don't like. Yeah, voters are still racist and sexist, but also they would believe that she has the mental cognition to do the job.
Yeah, I mean, not to speak up for the only South Asian in the race there, but like I feel like not only does she have a bad position at the moment, she's also had a bad position for the last 4 years, because I think it's evident that the Biden camp never wanted her to be seen as the more competent one, because that would have raised the questions about his age much earlier, and so she's never been allowed to even build up a role because he, even though he said he would be a transitional president, he didn't, follow through on that.
I think, Rohan, I think this is spot on. I think you're right to stand up for her on this, because in 2019, there's a Politico report that was like, Biden hints at being a one-term president. And he was clearly, he spoke about being sort of a transitional figure and passing the torch to the next generation. But when the time came, after a life of wanting to be president, he was not giving up that seat that easily. And I think they definitely wanted to make sure that people were not like, okay, like, it's Kamala's turn now. I think that's a completely correct fair read on the situation. And I will also say that yesterday we saw why this conversation is so important, which is that, okay, so listeners of this podcast may remember the last time we talked about whether or not presidents were immune of acts they committed in office. And I said, I don't even know why we're talking about this. Of course, presidents are not immune. We have rule of law. This is an insult to our intelligence. The fact that this conversation has even gone on as long as it has. Obviously, 6 out of 9 Supreme Court justices who are there for life disagreed with me on this point. They said, no, if it's an official act, the president is immune from accountability for having committed it. What is an official act, you might ask? That's a great question. I guess the Supreme Court justices will let us know on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, Amy Coney Barrett wrote in her bit, she was like, I don't think that pressuring an official in Georgia to find hidden votes would count as an official act. Oh, really, Amy? I'm glad. I'm glad that you don't think that that trying to falsify election results while president counts as an official act. But unfortunately, you've just opened up, like it's. So basically, they've said that we have a king. No, it just makes it much more difficult for the president to be held accountable for what he does in office. Like, say, any crimes he does that he then can say, oh, no, that was an official act. So if Trump's blackmailing of Ukraine to try to get them to open up an investigation into his political opponent, could he now just say, well, that was an official act? Like, probably that's what he would do. Biden comes out and is like, well, the American voters are going to dissent and God help us. Like, you're the president. What God's not attending to this one, obviously. Like, so I don't mean to be glib here, but like, again, is this a crisis or is it not a crisis? Right? Because if it were a crisis, like, we wouldn't just be saying, okay, go vote in November.
Can we go back to that Supreme Court decision? Because I mean, you've already said that you thought you knew how that was going to go on the basis of common sense, but
well, no, I mean,
sure.
Right? Like, given that we have political hacks who are masquerading as like legal minds, I think it's not that surprising. But based on the other like hundreds of years of this country's history of what is supposed to be, we're not supposed to have, like, we allegedly theoretically had rule of law.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's that on a pure common sense basis, it seems like a completely deranged opinion to take, and just not controversially either. And it shouldn't be a problem that you can't prosecute a president for stuff a president does, right? It's just it seems completely within the bounds of normal common sense. So maybe the answer to this is just they are partisan hacks, and fine, that's the end of the conversation. But how is it that you've got to a situation where 6 out of 9 justices can sign up with a straight face to that argument?
It's a really good question. Other decisions they made recently include basically saying agencies do not have, in the past, if there was something super technical or like regarding, say, an environmental regulation, we would defer to the agency. The judges have said, no, you'll actually defer to us. Now, this is the Chevron doctrine. I think they said that essentially that bribery of elected officials is less of a problem than you might have thought before. That was also a recent decision. So, but by the way, if you are homeless and sleep outside, like, you can be arrested for that. So I think, I think there has been this has been documented. Like, we know what the Federalist Project is. There was a long attempt to do a conservative, to sort of install conservative legal minds in the courts at various levels, and it worked. And I think what we are seeing is that was not about originalism, and that was not about small government, and that was not about any of these other things that we were told it was about. It was about power for the political right.
Sure, but at the same time, this is, and maybe I'm bending over backwards to be nice to people like George W. Bush or Mitt Romney or Ronald Reagan, or you name your significant figure of the right of the last few decades. But I just find it hard to imagine any of those figures even trying to get a decision of this type. Because,
I mean, some people are not going to like that. I mean, like there are some who would say that there was a Supreme Court decision that was actually even more impactful than this, which was the Bush v. Gore,
Sure.
which which some would argue that was as political as this was, and also like, how to put this? They're always political. These are. One of the great lies of American democracy to this point has been that these weren't political actors when we all knew that they were. I hope she doesn't get mad at me for saying this. My mom said yesterday, the court has never seemed so human to me as they do right now. And she did not mean that as a compliment. What she meant was like, they've revealed that below those black robes, right, they're political operatives using the law to sort of serve their desired aims. Yeah, and I don't think that's new, but I think that because the movement is as open and as vulgar and as craven, and that the decisions then need to match that, right? So,
yeah, one of the core. I mean, I haven't looked closely at the legal side of this. I've paid attention to the politics of it, but what really jumped out to me was the fact that this was even an open question, like an unsettled question. I don't mean that from a common sense point that you've made, but actually even from a why has this not been arbitrated in India? As I think in the UK, there's a certain level of parliamentary immunity for things you say and do within Parliament to keep the judiciary away from the legislature and to make sure that, you know, your actions as a parliamentarian are not going to be examined by the courts. But like that has been so carefully examined by the courts over the years that it's settled law a long time ago, in part because at lower levels of electoral politics, you often have false cases thrown against your rivals and so on. And so this has been adjudicated. And I really find it remarkable in 200 years of American democracy that this was also not like settled law.
I think it sort of was settled law, though, right? Yeah. Like Nixon had to resign and then had to be pardoned because of Watergate. So it's not like we were all going around being like, I wonder, like, so it's just people have been prosecuted. Yeah, people have been prosecuted for acts they committed while in office, or had to, or like been under threat of prosecution for acts they committed while in office. That's not so. It's very unsettling that they would do this, and that doesn't mean like, look, there were people yesterday who rightly noted like Obama droned a U.S. citizen and he wasn't held accountable. Yes, absolutely. Like American politics is full of hypocrisy, and shame. And what this decision says is, what if we just stripped away the layer of hypocrisy and just brought it all out, right? Just had unaccountability and corruption right at the surface. And I think, I say this in all sincerity, I've written this before, I think shame is a very important component of public life, and that we will miss it when it's gone.
Just in terms of the pragmatism that comes out of it is that it's going to delay the other case against him and leave aside the question of what he might do if he were to come back to power. From the election standpoint, the impact is primarily that it delays the case against him.
I'm not actually sure what the timeline is next. I think the Georgia case has been botched already, and I don't know. I think the Jack Smith case has been pushed back. I mean, we're now in June. The election's in November. So we ate up some time.
Yeah. It's interesting watching some of the other decisions that are being made as well, notably the Chevron case that you mentioned, mm-hmm. where that has clearly fallen on partisan lines as well. And yet watching that from a UK perspective, it is the legal position in the United States is now much closer to the legal position in the UK, actually, in terms of whether you can effectively, in the UK context, judicially review a decision made by a regulator or another body like that. And that is, it's not hugely controversial, but it certainly isn't thought of as a party political sort of issue. And I guess part of what's going on here is that at the point at which anything comes up for decision, at that point it becomes party political because people have come down on one side or the other. So what counts as controversial depends on what the previous status quo was, I guess. But one of the issues with the Trump case, which I think is truer of Trump than of Bush v. Gore, for example, which had a really, really decisive, and let's not understate the consequences of that particular decision, but it wasn't one that created precedent in quite the same way, whereas this appears to just made rules for presidents until such time as the rule is changed. I mean, in theory, it allows Biden to do all sorts of things that I'm sure Biden won't do, but that nevertheless could be hugely damaging to Trump.
Sorry, two things. One, and we can put this Ewan, please put this answer back where I said gave the Rohan answer. I just double checked. Yes, it's correct that this is from NBC. The Supreme Court's presidential immunity decision will further delay former President Donald Trump's Washington criminal case related to his efforts to stop the transfer of power in the lead up to the January 6th attack on U.S. Capitol, virtually guaranteeing that Trump's trial won't start before Election Day. So, yes, Rohan is correct that this will delay in addition to everything else. Okay, so that's the answer for the other one. And then, Tom, to your question. Yeah, that's right. I mean, Biden, okay, it was kind of funny. Funny, not haha, funny, like, oh God. Biden yesterday said in his speech about this decision, like, don't worry, I won't abuse this. Babe, this was never meant for you. You know what I mean? Like, don't worry, that is not what this is about. And I'm sure, like, this gang of six would still find a way to hold, like, come on, read the room. They're not trying to make you immune, like they're trying to make your successor immune. Yeah, I think people were like, a Democrat would not. No, it's not for Democrats. It's for. Come on, let's be real here. Anyway, that's where we at. That's where we are at in America. And actually, I want to add another wrinkle in this week's Tricycle Recommends. This is a piece from The Guardian by Tess Owen. Trump loyalists plan to name and shame a blacklist of federal workers. This is the first couple of graphs. Armed with rhetoric about the deep state, a conservative-backed group is planning to publicly name and shame career government employees that they consider hostile to Donald Trump. This blacklist of civil servants, which will be published online, is intended to advance Trump's broader goals, which, if elected, include weeding out government employees and replacing them with loyalists. Okay. This is part of Project Sovereignty 2025. I'm sure we'll talk about Project 2025 more between now and the election. I have to say, as the wife of a civil servant, I find this bone chilling. And also just, even if I were not, I would hope that I would be concerned that in a country that's like awash with weapons, people are going to publish the names of those they consider disloyal to dear leader online.
I always ask one more question, just to sort of bring these two main plots together in terms of the debate about Biden and his viability and the debate about the Supreme Court decision, which is, does the Supreme Court decision heighten the stakes even further in terms of making those people who think Biden can't be the candidate here because he can't win, make them think and give them more arguments to say this has to change now because look what the guy can do if he wins.
I saw some yesterday who were frustrated that the media was still talking about Biden's age and not the Supreme Court decision. And on one level, I totally get and agree, and I'm sympathetic with that. Like, this is so catastrophic that it should get most of our focus. But on the other hand, I do sort of think, to your point, Tom, that they're the same story. Because again, if this is a crisis of whether or not we will continue to be a democratic republic, is this the person who is best able to defend that? Like, are you going to tell me that in a country of 300 plus million people, this gentleman is the best to keep us a place with rule of law? And what is he doing right now to do that, to prove that? So yes, I think I sort of think they're the same story, which is, how badly do American elites want to save American democracy? But what is your tricycle recommends this week?
Well, speaking of folks saving the country and speaking up in terms of constitutionality and so on, maybe my recommendation is one of the sharpest observers of the Indian election over the last year has been the political scientist Asim Ali, who writes in various places. But I'll point to one of his recent pieces in the Times of India, which is headlined "A Not To-Do List for Rahul and Priyanka," who are the siblings who sort of lead the Congress party, which is now resurgent and so on. It's a very interesting piece looking at what space that opposition party ought to take up in the aftermath of their surprising numbers in this election. But Asim's work in general has been quite vital to understanding what's been happening in India over the last few years. So look up his work in general.
So my choice for this week is we're going back to America rather than the UK because it's where all the interest is, even though, as I keep saying, we've got an election this week in the UK, and yet it's not the biggest story. And it's a piece from it's a piece from last November by someone called Jeff Maurer on his Substack, in the voice of Joe Biden, saying, and the headline is, "Don't worry, I got advice about preserving my legacy from Ruth Bader Ginsburg." And it's a really lovely piece, basically setting out, getting on for a year ago, the argument for Joe Biden saying, look, I did my duty. I was the guy that defeated Trump when probably no one else could have done in 2020, but I knew when it was time to quit and hand over to someone else. Now, of course, we now know that not only
there's some other
not
universe where that's what happened. We had like a robust primary, and some person who's like younger than 60 is the Democratic Party candidate, and the debate went great, but that's not
exactly.
This branch, right? Also, in some other branch, Slovakia won the Euro game, and England didn't score in the last 30 seconds and didn't go through to the quarterfinals. But here we are,
Yeah. We've got it's a desperate attempt to create a feel-good factor for Rishi Sunak in the run-up to the election.
Exactly.
I'm not sure it's quite going to work.
All right. Well, regular listeners, thanks for joining us for Doom Chat this week. We'll be back next week to unpack the results of the British election.